What if the wisdom of age became a magnet for a terrible death? What if the very act of living a long life opened the door to suffering most profound? In the medieval world, roughly from 500 AD to 1500 AD, reaching old age was a rare gift, but it also carried its own dark burdens. Number 1. The bubonic plague. The mere mention of its name even now can send a chill down the spine, a whisper of a terror so absolute it reshaped entire continents. For the elderly in the medieval period, the bubonic plague, often called the Black Death, was not just a disease, it was an apocalyptic event, a swift, brutal judgment that seemed to pluck the old and frail from their places in the community with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't a slow decline, it was a sudden, violent ending, stripping away years of hard-won wisdom and experience in a matter of days, sometimes even hours. Imagine the daily life in a bustling medieval town or a quiet village. The rhythm was set by the sun, the seasons, the church bells for the elderly. Their roles were well defined. They were the keepers of stories, the tenders of children, the menders of nets, the spinners of wool. The wise ones consulted for their knowledge of herbs or weather patterns. Their hands, gnarled by years of toil, were still productive. Their minds, sharp with a lifetime of observation, held the collective memory of the community. Then came the plague, a shadow stretching across the land from the east, carried by fleas on rats, but understood by no one. When the plague arrived, it was often heralded by whispers of distant deaths, then by the sudden, inexplicable illness of a neighbor. For the elderly already living with the natural decline of age, the first symptoms would have been horrifyingly clear. A crushing fatigue, unlike any they had known, would descend, leaving them too weak to rise from their straw beds. Then the fever would spike an internal fire that burned through the body, bringing with it chills and uncontrollable shivering. The mind, once a clear pool of memory, would become a foggy, confused mess, filled with nightmares, even when awake. Historical accounts from chroniclers like Jean de Venette speak of people falling ill in the morning and dying by evening, a swiftness that left no time for goodbyes, no time for last rites, no time even for understanding. The signature of the plague was the buboes. These swollen, painful lymph nodes, often the size of an apple or an egg, would erupt in the groin, the armpits, or the neck. For an elderly person whose skin might already be thin and whose circulation less robust, these swellings would have been indescribably agonizing. The skin would stretch tight, becoming discolored, turning a sickening purple or black. The pain would be so intense it would rob the sufferer of their voice, leaving them to moan in agony, their breath ragged and shallow. The very sight of these buboes was enough to strike fear into the hearts of family members, for they were the undeniable mark of the plague, a death sentence written on the body. The medieval understanding of disease was rooted in the theory of humors, a delicate balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance, or sometimes as a punishment from God, or the result of bad air called miasma. For the elderly, whose humors were believed to be naturally cooler and drier, an illness like the plague was seen as a catastrophic disruption, an internal corruption that medieval physicians, with their limited tools, were utterly powerless to combat. They might bleed the patient, cutting veins to release bad blood, a practice that would only further weaken an already frail body. They might apply hot compresses to the buboes, attempting to draw out the poison, or cold poultices to cool the fever. All in vain. These desperate measures only added to the suffering, offering no relief, only prolonging the agony of the final hours. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. Their immune systems, even if they had survived other childhood diseases, were likely weaker. Existing ailments, like arthritis or chronic coughs, would have made them less able to resist the plague's onslaught. A chronicler in Florence wrote of the young and strong being struck down, but also noted how the plague seemed to sweep through households, often taking the oldest and youngest first. The very proximity within a family home, where generations often lived under one roof, meant that once one person contracted the disease, it was highly likely to spread to the others, especially vulnerable, elderly, who spent more time indoors. In many communities, their wisdom and experience were deeply valued. They were the bridge to the past, the teachers of tradition, the guardians of the community's collective knowledge. When they died, especially in such numbers that accumulated wisdom was lost forever, sons and daughters, grandchildren who might have cared for them, were also falling victim to the plague. This meant that many elderly people might have found themselves suddenly alone, their caregivers gone, facing their terrifying symptoms, with no one to offer comfort, no one to fetch water, no one to offer a final prayer. The isolation of their last days, even in a crowded village, would have been absolute. Records from monasteries and town councils tell a grim story of the plague's relentless march. Priests, already overwhelmed with caring for the sick and burying the dead, often fell victim themselves. This left many elderly people to face death without the spiritual solace of a priest, without the last rites that were so crucial for their salvation in medieval belief. The fear was not just of physical agony, but also of eternal damnation, if they died unconfessed. The sheer speed of death meant that many did die without the opportunity to confess their sins. Adding a layer of spiritual terror to the physical horror, burial became an impossible task. The dead accumulated faster than they could be interred. Accounts describe bodies being piled in mass graves, sometimes without proper shrouds, without individual blessings. For an elderly person who had lived their life with a deep reverence for death and a strong belief in the proper journey to the afterlife, the thought of such an undignified mass burial would have been a terrifying prospect. It was an affront to their very being, a denial of the respect due to a life lived. The dignity of age, hard-earned over decades, was stripped away in the macabre chaos of the plague pits. The terror of the bubonic plague for the medieval elderly was not just the physical suffering, which was immense, but the complete unraveling of their world. It was the loss of their roles, the disappearance of their caregivers, the denial of their spiritual needs, and the obliteration of their very dignity in death. It was a disease that targeted not just the body, but the very essence of what it meant to be old and wise in a world suddenly turned upside down. The plague left survivors, of course, but for those it took, especially the elderly. It was a terrifying, swift, and utterly merciless end to a life that had, against all odds, managed to reach its final years. Number 2. Dysentery. The medieval world was a place where clean water was often a luxury, and hygiene was a concept barely understood. For the elderly, this meant that the ubiquitous menace of dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was a constant, gnawing fear. Unlike the sudden explosive horror of the plague, dysentery could be a slow, agonizing drain on life, particularly cruel to those already weakened by age. It promised a prolonged, debilitating journey towards a death that was as undignified as it was painful. A constant reminder of the fragility of the human body and the relentless march of unseen contagions. Dysentery was not a single disease as we understand it today, but rather a collection of severe diarrheal illnesses caused by bacteria or amoebas. Its primary mode of transmission was through contaminated food and water, or direct contact with infected feces. In a world where privies often emptied into rivers, where human and animal waste was common in the streets, and where hand-washing was not a routine practice, the opportunities for infection were endless. For the elderly, who might have less robust digestive systems, or be more prone to dehydration, dysentery was a highly efficient killer. The onset of dysentery was often insidious. It might begin with a general feeling of unwellness, a dull ache in the abdomen, and a loss of appetite. For an elderly person, these symptoms might initially be dismissed as the natural aches and pains of age, or a passing chill, but then the true horror would begin. The diarrhea would start first, watery, then becoming increasingly severe and frequent, it was the blood that made it truly terrifying. The passage of bloody mucus-laden stools, often dozens of times a day, was a clear sign of the disease's grip, a visible manifestation of the body literally emptying itself. Its vital fluids draining away the pain associated with dysentery was extreme. The constant cramping in the abdomen, known as tenesmus, was described in medieval texts as agonizing, a perpetual urge to defecate, even when the bowels were empty. This relentless spazzing would leave an elderly person writhing in discomfort, unable to find a moment of peace. Each attempt to relieve themselves would bring more pain, more blood, and further exhaustion. The physical toll was immense, leaving the sufferer drained of strength, their muscles aching, their body trembling from the effort. Dehydration was the immediate and most lethal consequence. An elderly person, already potentially frail, and perhaps drinking less than a younger, more active individual, would succumb rapidly to the loss of fluids and electrolytes. Their skin would become dry and papery, their eyes sunken, their lips cracked. The mind, once clear, would grow clouded with delirium as the body withered. Accounts from sieges or famine periods often detail dysentery as a leading cause of death, especially among those already weakened by lack of food, a condition often experienced by the elderly when resources were scarce. The social ramifications of dysentery for the elderly were particularly grim. The constant involuntary expulsion of bodily waste meant a profound loss of dignity. For a society that valued cleanliness, albeit within its own limitations, the stench and mess associated with dysentery would have been deeply unpleasant. An elderly person, already dependent on family for care, in many instances would become an even greater burden. The fear of contagion, even if ill understood, would often lead to isolation. While some families would provide devoted care, others might, out of fear or sheer inability, distance themselves, leaving the elderly sufferer to face their humiliating and painful end alone, perhaps in a corner of the house shunned. Medieval physicians, operating under the humoral theory, would attempt various remedies. They might prescribe astringent herbs like plantain or tormentil, hoping to bind the bowels. They might recommend fasting, which would only worsen the dehydration and weakness. Bleeding or purging with strong laxatives were also common, further accelerating the body's decline. These treatments, while well-intentioned, often exacerbated the patient's condition, pushing them closer to death. The helplessness of both the patient and their caregivers in the face of such relentless bodily failure was absolute. The medieval diet, often heavy in grains and lacking in fresh produce or varied nutrients, also contributed to the vulnerability of the elderly. Malnutrition, even subclinical, could weaken the gut lining and the immune system, making them more susceptible to dysentery and less able to fight it off. During times of scarcity, the elderly might receive less food, further compromising their resistance. This interplay of poor nutrition, poor sanitation, and the relentless assault of bacteria created a perfect storm for the elderly. Historical records, particularly those from monastic communities or military campaigns, frequently mention outbreaks of the flux. Monks living in close quarters and often consuming shared food and water were particularly vulnerable. For the older monks who had dedicated their lives to spiritual pursuits, succumbing to such a base, undignified illness would have been a profound trial. Their last days spent in constant pain, their body betraying them in the most fundamental way, would have been a spiritual as well as a physical torment. The lingering nature of dysentery also meant that even if an elderly person survived the acute phase, they might be left with lasting weakness, digestive problems, or chronic fatigue. This could reduce their ability to contribute to the household or community, turning a once active elder into a permanent invalid, further increasing their dependence. This prolonged suffering, the gradual decline rather than a sudden end, was perhaps its own unique horror. It was a disease that did not offer a quick escape, but instead promised a drawn-out, humiliating, and incredibly painful path to the grave, stripping away dignity and life force with every agonizing bowel movement. The very thought of it would have filled a medieval elderly with a profound dread, a chilling prospect of their final days. Number 3. Smallpox. Among the unseen threats that stalked the medieval world, smallpox stood as a terrifying specter, not just for its deadly potential, but for its ability to disfigure, to leave its mark indelibly upon those who survived. For the medieval elderly, smallpox presented a unique set of fears: the terror of a painful, feverish death, the crushing burden of blindness or disfigurement, and the potential for a swift, overwhelming infection in a body already less robust. It was a disease that could steal not just life, but also vision, leaving its victims reliant on others in a society that offered little formal support for the truly disabled. Smallpox was a highly contagious viral disease spread through respiratory droplets and direct contact. It was endemic in many medieval communities, meaning it was always present, flaring up in devastating epidemics every few years. While many individuals acquired some immunity through childhood exposure, new strains or the reintroduction of the disease into isolated communities could be catastrophic. For the elderly, who might have weakened immune systems, or who might have lived in regions where certain strains were less common, the arrival of smallpox was a horrifying proposition. The initial symptoms of smallpox were often deceptive, mimicking other, less deadly fevers. A sudden onset of high fever, intense headaches, and severe body aches would grip the sufferer. For an elderly person already prone to such complaints from other ailments, these early signs might not immediately signal the true horror to come. But within a few days, the characteristic rash would begin to appear, first as small red spots on the face and extremities, then spreading rapidly across the entire body, including the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. This alone was a chilling sight, confirming the dreaded diagnosis. The progression of the rash was agonizing. The spots would quickly evolve into raised bumps, then into fluid-filled blisters called vesicles. These would then become pustules, filled with thick, opaque pus, giving the skin a pock-marked, grotesque appearance. The itching would have been unbearable, driving sufferers to scratch incessantly, further damaging the skin and increasing the risk of secondary bacterial infections. For an elderly person whose skin might already be fragile, this intense itching and the subsequent scratching could lead to widespread skin breakdown, a painful and potentially fatal complication. The pain from the pustules, particularly those on the face, would have been excruciating. Swelling of the eyelids was common, often causing temporary or even permanent blindness. Imagine being an elderly person, your vision already perhaps fading, suddenly plunged into total darkness by the ravages of smallpox. This terrifying prospect was a very real outcome. Historical accounts speak of smallpox epidemics leaving a trail of the blind in their wake, a burden on society, and a profound personal tragedy. For an elder whose livelihood or ability to care for themselves depended on their sight, this was a life-altering, horrifying consequence. The fever would continue to rage throughout the pustular stage, draining the body of strength. Many elderly people would simply succumb to the sheer exhaustion, the overwhelming infection, or to complications like pneumonia, which was a common cause of death in smallpox cases. Their weakened lungs would be unable to fight off the secondary invaders, leading to a suffocating, painful end. The putrid smell emanating from the festering pustules, a smell often described by survivors, would have made the bedside a truly sickening place, further isolating the sufferer. For those elderly who survived smallpox, the physical and social scarring could be immense. The deep pits and scars left by the pustules, particularly on the face, were permanent, leaving them visibly disfigured, a constant reminder of their ordeal. In a society that valued appearances even subtly, such disfigurement could lead to social ostracization, or at least a sense of shame or pity. An elderly person perhaps a revered matriarch or patriarch, now marked and disfigured, might find their social standing subtly altered, their dignity eroded by the ravages of the disease. Medieval medical practices for smallpox were largely ineffective. Remedies included various herbal concoctions aimed at reducing fever or drawing out the poison. Red wraps were sometimes used, based on the belief that red color could ward off the disease or absorb its heat. These practices offered no real cure and little comfort. The disease simply had to run its course. And for the elderly, that course was often a downhill one, leading to death or profound disability. The fear of smallpox was also rooted in its highly contagious nature. An elderly person living in a household with children and other adults would recognize the danger when the first cough or fever appeared. The terrible choice might present itself to isolate themselves and risk loneliness in their final days, or to remain with family and risk infecting them, particularly the vulnerable young, whose deaths would be a devastating blow. This moral dilemma added another layer of terror to the physical threat of the disease. Historical chronicles and records from various medieval lands are filled with references to smallpox outbreaks, detailing the high mortality rates and the widespread disfigurement left behind. It was a disease that spared no one. But for the elderly, it was a particular terror, threatening not only to extinguish their lives in a blaze of fever and pain, but also to strip them of their sight, their dignity, and their place in a world where physical capability and unmarred appearance. The visible scars of smallpox were a constant chilling reminder of its power, a testament to the brutal, unpredictable nature of medieval disease. Number 4. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, known in the medieval period as consumption or the White Plague, was not the sudden, brutal assault of the Black Death or the swift, disfiguring horror of smallpox. Instead, it was a slow, insidious thief, gradually stealing the breath, the strength, and eventually the life from its victims. For the medieval elderly, consumption represented a particularly cruel fate, a prolonged decline marked by persistent suffering, isolation, and a gradual wasting away that stripped them of their vitality and dignity, transforming them into spectral versions of their former selves. It was a death by inches, stretched over months, sometimes even years. The disease was caused by bacteria, but in the medieval mind its origins were often attributed to imbalances of the humors, cold and dampness, or even hereditary weakness. Its slow progression meant that it could linger in a household, silently infecting others, particularly those living in close quarters. For the elderly, whose immune systems might be less robust, and whose living conditions might involve damp, poorly ventilated homes, tuberculosis was a constant, lurking threat. It was often exacerbated by malnutrition, poor diet, and the general hardships of medieval life. The initial symptoms of consumption were often subtle, easily dismissed as the ordinary complaints of old age. A persistent cough, a slight fatigue, a general feeling of being unwell. But gradually the cough would deepen, becoming more frequent and productive, bringing up phlegm that could be stained with blood. This sight, the red flecks in the sputum, would be a chilling sign, a clear indicator that the disease was advancing, eating away at the lungs from within. For an elderly person, who might already suffer from other respiratory ailments, this worsening cough would be deeply distressing, signaling a slow, painful end. As the disease progressed, the sufferer would experience night sweats so profound they would soak through bedding, leaving them cold and shivering in the dawn. A low-grade fever would become constant, draining their energy. The weight loss was perhaps the most visible and terrifying symptom. The body would begin to waste away, the muscles atrophying, the bones becoming more prominent, the skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. This emaciation earned the disease its name, consumption, as if the patient was being consumed from within. For an elderly person who had worked hard their entire life to maintain their strength, this relentless wasting would be a profound loss of self, a visible sign of their impending dissolution. The weakness would become debilitating. An elderly person who once walked with purpose would become breathless after only a few steps. Eventually, they would be confined to their bed, too weak to move, too weak to eat more than a few mouthfuls. The constant cough would interrupt their sleep, making rest impossible. The lack of effective treatments meant that medieval physicians were largely powerless. They might prescribe nourishing foods, though often the patient had no appetite. They might recommend fresh air or specific herbs, but these offered no real cure for the relentless bacterial assault on the lungs. The social impact of consumption on the elderly was complex and often tragic. Because of its slow progression, the disease offered a prolonged period of suffering, often witnessed by family members. This meant that the elderly sufferer became a prolonged burden, requiring constant care, feeding, and tending. While some families would offer devoted love and attention, the sheer duration of the illness could strain resources and emotional endurance. The fear of contagion, though not always fully understood, would also lead to a degree of isolation. Family members might avoid close contact, leaving the ailing elder feeling abandoned and alone in their slow decline. The spiritual implications were also significant. For the elderly, death was an ever-present reality, and the medieval period emphasized the importance of a good death, one in which the individual could confess their sins, receive the last rites, and prepare their soul for the afterlife. Consumption, with its drawn-out nature, offered this opportunity, but it also meant a long period of spiritual anguish, grappling with their impending mortality, and perhaps dwelling on past sins. The protracted agony could also test their faith, leading to moments of despair. Records for medieval hospitals and infirmaries often mentioned patients suffering from chronic coughs and wasting diseases, many of whom would have been victims of tuberculosis. Monastic infirmaries, designed to care for ailing brethren, would have housed many older monks, slowly succumbing to consumption, their voices reduced to a rasp, their bodies fading. These records offer a glimpse into the long, arduous path to death that consumption offered, a path trod by many elderly individuals. The eventual end, when it came, would often be from overwhelming respiratory failure, the lungs so damaged they could no longer draw breath. Or it might be from a sudden hemorrhage, a final, terrifying expulsion of blood that ended their suffering. For the medieval elderly, consumption was a terror because it promised a protracted, painful farewell to life, stripping away not just their physical strength but also their active role in the family and community. It was a disease that transformed a respected elder into a frail, coughing shadow, slowly fading away, a chilling reminder of the body's ultimate fragility and the relentless cruelty of chronic illness in a world without cure. Number 5. Erysipelas. Erysipelas, often known in the medieval period as St. Anthony's fire due to its burning sensation and the patron saint invoked against it, was a terrifying skin infection that could have devastating consequences. While not as widespread or globally avid as the plague, erysipelas struck with a visible, painful fury, turning the skin fiery red and swollen, often leading to gangrene and limb loss. For an elderly person, whose skin was thinner, whose circulation might be weaker, and whose immune system less robust, St. Anthony's fire represented a unique and horrifying threat, a localized torment that could rapidly escalate. Pronounced pain, disfigurement at. This infection was caused by bacteria, typically Streptococcus, entering the body through a cut, scratch, or even a tiny crack in the skin. In the medieval world, where injuries were common, hygiene was poor, and infections went untreated, the opportunities for such bacteria to enter the body were plentiful. For the elderly, minor cuts, scrapes from daily tasks, or even skin conditions like ulcers on the legs could serve as entry points. Once the bacteria gained purchase, they would spread rapidly through the lymphatic system just beneath the skin's surface. The onset of erysipelas was dramatic and unmistakable. It would often begin with a small, red raised patch of skin, usually on the face, particularly around the nose and cheeks, or on an arm or leg. But unlike a simple rash, this patch would quickly enlarge, spreading outwards with a distinct, raised border, often described as feeling like an orange peel. The skin within the affected area would become intensely red, hot to the touch, and exquisitely painful. The fire in its name was no exaggeration. Sufferers described a burning, stinging sensation that was constant and agonizing. For an elderly person, this intense pain could be debilitating. The affected area would swell considerably, making movement difficult and further adding to the discomfort. If it was on the face, the swelling could distort features, making it difficult to open eyes or speak. If it was on a limb, the pain could prevent walking or using the arm, rendering the elderly person immobile and utterly dependent. The fever and chills that accompany the spreading infection would further weaken an already frail body, contributing to a sense of profound malaise and exhaustion. The medieval understanding of erysipelas, like other diseases, was often steeped in humoral theory, with red-hot conditions linked to an excess of blood or yellow bile. Treatments would often involve purges, bloodletting, or cooling compresses made with herbs. These were utterly ineffective against a bacterial infection. The lack of antibiotics meant that the disease would simply run its course, often with devastating consequences. Monks and healers associated with Saint Anthony were often sought out, with people believing that his intercession could cool the fire of the disease, a testament to the desperate hope. Inspired by such a visibly horrific ailment, the true terror of erysipelas, especially for the elderly, lay in its potential for rapid progression and severe complications. The infection could spread from the skin into deeper tissues, leading to cellulitis, abscesses, or even gangrene. If the infection became systemic, it could lead to sepsis, a widespread infection of the bloodstream that was almost always fatal in the medieval era. For an elderly person whose body might already struggle to fight off infection, this rapid escalation was a death sentence. When gangrene set in, the affected skin and flesh would turn black, literally dying and rotting on the body. This horrific sight, coupled with the putrid smell, would be a nightmare for both the sufferer and their caregivers. If the gangrene affected a limb, the only treatment in the medieval world was amputation, a brutal and often fatal procedure performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions. For an elderly person, surviving such an ordeal was a rare exception, leaving them maimed and often succumbing to shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. The prospect of losing a limb, of becoming an invalid, was a terrifying thought for anyone, but especially for an elder who relied on their limited mobility and independence. The social impact on the elderly was significant. The disfigurement and pain of erysipelas could be profoundly isolating. The ghastly appearance of the affected skin, often bright red and swollen, coupled with the unpleasant smell, if gangrene developed, might lead family members or neighbors to keep their distance, fearing contagion or simply unable to cope with the sight. An elderly person, already potentially vulnerable to neglect, could find themselves utterly alone in their agonizing decline. Historical records, though not always as detailed as for the plague, mention outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire and similar skin infections. Accounts of people suffering from burning, spreading redness on their skin, sometimes leading to blackening of limbs, point to the presence of erysipelas. These were localized horrors, but no less terrifying for the individuals afflicted. The fear was visceral, a direct assault on the body's largest organ, promising extreme pain, grotesque disfigurement, and a high probability of a slow, agonizing death through infection or the horror of gangrene. For the medieval elderly, who might have faced other ailments with stoicism, the fiery torment and visible destruction of erysipelas would have been a truly horrifying prospect, a visible manifestation of their body's vulnerability